Thank you so much, Nick, for that really kind introduction, and congratulations on your appointment. I'm sure it's going to be a very exciting time and a great job for you. One of the great privileges of my job is that I do get to go and speak to lots of different groups of people all over the country about human rights. And coming to talk to you today, I'm reflecting on the fact that in recent days, last week, I spoke to the Institute of Psychoanalysis one evening. That was quite a scary audience, actually. I have to tell you, they sat incredibly still. It was kind of, imagine a couple of hundred, they are the Freudians, by the way, not to be confused with the Kleinians or the Jungians. They did explain the difference to me at one point, but it's one of those things, it's a bit like the offside rule in football. Every time it's explained, it crystallizes for 10 seconds and then it leaves me again. So I spoke to them one night, and then the next morning, I had to go to Birmingham to speak as a guest of the Bishop of Birmingham to all of his Birmingham clergy. And then I got their take and their perspective on human rights. But I'm particularly proud to be speaking to your conference today. I love libraries and I love books, and they always make me think of my late mother, who taught me to read and write before I went to school, who took me on my first library visit. And so she's the guilty woman. She's responsible for someone who grew up to be what the Sun newspaper once called the most dangerous woman in Britain. And of course, that's the gift that keeps on giving. And I tell you, it gives particularly well in the great city of Liverpool. I tell you, you get to come to Liverpool and say the Sun newspaper called me the most dangerous woman in Britain. It's like standing ovations and so. But unfortunately, the wretched Daily Mail newspaper, during this past general election campaign, rather stole my title and awarded it to a rather charismatic politician north of the border. Who I had the pleasure of meeting in Holyrood a couple of weeks ago, and to add insult to injury, she is as clever and charming as she appears, and she's also a few years younger than me. But I want to tell you a little bit about liberty and about the challenges to rights and freedoms that we're dealing with at the moment. But by way of introduction, Liberty is the National Council for Civil Liberties, and we were formed in 1934. And you might think 1934, 2015, these two dates couldn't have anything in common, really. Very, very different times, 1934. And of course, you're right. 1934, we practically didn't have TV, let alone CCTV or reality TV. In 1934, we hadn't discovered DNA, let alone the practice of taking samples from people, innocent people, and stockpiling them and profiling that data. In 1934, shock horror, there was no internet. Something that my 13-year-old son finds impossible to imagine. It's like a world without the printing press. And actually, I think the analogy is probably quite a good one, isn't it, in terms of the revolution for knowledge and information that the internet brings us, as well as the challenges that it presents. So very different times. And yet, in 1934, you'll recall it was a time of great economic uncertainty, austerity. In 1934, certain newspapers that I've already named would regularly run front-page headlines about how awful it was that refugees were coming to this country from Eastern Europe. And the particular trigger for the formation of my organisation is that hunger marchers came from the north of the country and they marched all the way to London. They assembled in Hyde Park, where they were promptly duffed up by the Metropolitan Police. Forgive the legalistic jargon. Now, of course, that would never happen today, would it? And what's more, the method that was employed by the police was that some of them went undercover as hunger marchers, and behaved violently, deliberately to provoke and justify an oppressive policing response. Now, some people might think that would never happen today, and then I remind them of my friend Doreen Lawrence, who of course is now the Baroness Doreen Lawrence of Clarendon. She is a national treasure. She's even in Marks and Spencer's commercials. But goodness me, she's had a tough life and a long, hard fight. You know, some of us chose to be campaigners. In my case, I'm a recovering lawyer. Perhaps you never recover. I'm sort of in remission. One drink at a time is the way to deal with that. But Doreen didn't have a choice. You'll know her story and how she became possibly the closest thing we have to a Martin Luther King in terms of her impact on race equality in this country. But the hits keep on coming, and more than 20 years after Stephen Lawrence's murder, we find out not only did the police not adequately investigate Stephen's murder, they were investigating Doreen instead. When she started her campaign for justice, not just for her family, but for other people's families, for racial justice in this country, and she became an embarrassment to the police, they put undercover cops in her friendship circle, in her home. And what about the women in the environmental movement? Do you know where I'm going with this? Those women who went to Greenpeace meetings not so many years ago, and formed friendships and then intimate relationships with men who they thought were their partners over many years. Sometimes they had children together, only later to find out, after the man has disappeared, that he was actually an undercover police officer from the Special Demonstration Squad, keeping an eye on them because they were environmental campaigners. I mean, these are not jihadis. These are vegetarians, you know. There's a limit to what a bit of bad quinoa can do to you. So there you have it. You know, some things change and some things don't change nearly enough. But it was that scandal of the oppression of the hunger marches that led to the founding of Liberty. And a small group of people, much smaller than this audience in this great hall, met in the crypt of St Martin in the Fields Church in Trafalgar Square. You know it, just opposite the National Gallery and the National Portrait Gallery. And they were a small group of people, and of course they had no internet, so no tweeting or blogging or Facebooking or Instagramming. What they had to do was to write an old-fashioned letter to what was then the Manchester Guardian newspaper. And it's fairly clumsy in the delivery because writing letters by committee is never ideal, as you know. It's not the most elegant prose, but the sentiment is very important. They've been horrified by the treatment of the hunger marches of these peaceful dissenters, and they had that day, in February 1934, formed the National Council for Civil Liberties to keep watch over the entire spirit of liberty in our country. And this group of people, you know, they went on to do nothing else very important in their lives. You wouldn't have heard of most of them. You know, people like, I don't know, Clement Attlee and H.G. Wells and Vera Brittain and Edith Summerskill and E.M. Forster, you know, ne'er-do-wells like that. Activists, lawyers, writers involved in our movement from the very start, I think perhaps for quite obvious reasons. And we still have a very healthy group in our membership called Writers for Liberty, even today. Fast forward from 1934 to I think the next really important moment in our history, and that is the post-war moment. This is the moment that freedom struggles around the world come together in the notion of universal human rights. And we know why. It's because of a generation that has lived through the horrors of the Holocaust and the Blitz, and has seen the bags of bones that have been carried out of extermination camps and Japanese prisoner of war camps. And they decided, it's extraordinary if you think about it. Think now about how hard it is to get international agreement on anything. You know, to get real, you know, really viable, enforceable collective agreements on climate change or bank regulation or whatever it happens to be. Really difficult. They come together in that moment and they forge the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, Eleanor Roosevelt's legacy. And they say there's got to be some values that we share and that we abide by, not as citizens of any one country, because of course the Nazis demonstrated so graphically that citizens' rights are privileges that can be given and taken away by the mob or the political community. No, we need human rights for human beings, for every newborn baby and every newly arrived refugee anywhere in the world. And we need values that we can all share globally. And that's the Universal Declaration, which is then made enforceable by regional instruments. And our own one is, of course, the much maligned European Convention on Human Rights. And that isn't Eleanor Roosevelt's legacy, that is Winston Churchill's post-war legacy. Ironically, given the current debate, drafted for the most part by English conservative lawyers. Winston Churchill, David Maxwell Fyfe, who went on to be a Conservative Lord Chancellor, this was their project. And they wanted some hard-edged traditional rights and freedoms that had been long enjoyed in Britain to be part of the bedrock of post-war Europe. And I have to tell you, we've had a lot of Magna Carta stuff recently, haven't we? I've kind of had it up to here with Magna Carta. In the words of that great legal philosopher, Tony Hancock, remember Magna Carta, did she die in vain? Do you know what I'm going to say? Senior politicians go to Runnymede and drink Pimm's and champagne. There's nothing wrong with a drink. But they celebrate Magna Carta 1 minute and they want to scrap the Human Rights Act and pull out of the European Convention on Human Rights the next. What is that about? What is that about? So what are the rights and freedoms in the Convention and now in our Human Rights Act that allows the Convention rights to be adjudicated here at home, not just in the Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg? It takes 6 or 10 years to get a case on there. Well, the right to life, not everlasting life, you understand. You have to go to a different church for that. But the right to positive protection of life and to an independent and robust investigation into any untimely death. The right not to be subject to inhuman or degrading treatment or torture. You know, that ought to be, ancient history now, but sadly it isn't. You'll recall that even over the last decade, even great democracies like the UK and the US have indulged in torture in freedom's name. They call it extraordinary rendition. It's not beautiful singing, it's kidnap and torture. When you do my job, there are certain adjectives that you're not supposed to use, because if you use them, people stop listening and they stop taking you seriously. One of them is Kafkaesque, another is Orwellian. I can't have the director of Liberty calling everything Orwellian the whole time. So I have to struggle to find other adjectives, you see, that are less of a cliche. I went through a phase of chilling. Then I got carried away with that adjective, and some smartass on Twitter said, that Chakrabarti finds everything chilling. That woman sees refrigerators everywhere. So let's return to your men and women of letters and books. So let's return to this adjective Orwellian for a moment. See, for me, it was never about how many cameras there are in your street. It's not Orwellian isn't having 25 CCTV cameras rather than 5 in your street, though there are too many cameras. For me, Orwellian is really reminiscent of that great essay, The Politics of the English Language. When he talks about the way in which the abuse of language can lead to the contortion of ideas and ultimately to the abuse of people. And I think we've seen a lot of that in recent years. Extraordinary rendition was not beautiful singing or even great wall rendering. Waterboarding was not a seaside sport. Even the war on terror itself, I think, was a very, very dangerous euphemism because it creates the concept of a permanent emergency. I'm not making light of the threat that's posed by terrorism, but politically motivated violence has always been part of the human experience. If you declare a war on terror, you are declaring a war without end. a permanent emergency, and that means a new way of life without the rights and freedoms that you have come to enjoy because you've created this permanent state of emergency. And it's incredibly dangerous for democracy, I think, because understandably we do compromise on rights and freedoms in times of war. In World War II, there were curfews and rationing and even identity cards, though it took a long time to get rid of those after the war. And when you're in a conventional war, you don't, as citizens, know when it's going to end, but you do know that you will be able to verify the end of the war with your own senses. The bombs will stop falling, there will be a peace treaty, there will be something that you can verify as the end of the emergency. But not so with a war on terror, which Donald Rumsfeld also referred to as the long war or the new normal. The new normal. How do you know when the war on terror's over? You're waiting for yet another Bush or yet another Clinton, the 23rd or the 24th, President Clinton, President Bush, to say, one more push, guys, and the war on terror might be over. No. That's genuinely chilling. Reach for the refrigerator for that one, I think. And it's that kind of permanent emergency that allowed great Democrats to engage in even in torture. Then there's the right against slavery, which ought to be ancient history again, and yet not. There is modern-day slavery even in our country. Vulnerable people who've either been trafficked or who have learning difficulties or who are vulnerable for whatever reason, who are actually working in servitude without being paid, sometimes for years. And you know, without the Human Rights Act, we wouldn't have a criminal offence of holding someone a slave. Did you know that, again, all the celebrations about, 200 years since the abolition of the slave trade, but in English law there was no criminal offence of holding someone as a slave. And we at Liberty worked with more grassroots organisations who were in touch with the scale of the problem. Often trafficked women, or agricultural workers who were effectively enslaved. And the police would do nothing because they said there wasn't a criminal offence. And the way that it worked was, if you lock the door, that's false imprisonment. If you threaten someone or you act violently towards someone, well, there are offences against the person, though they're not always easiest to prove. But what if you just have someone in your thrall because you hold their passport, or they're vulnerable, or they're afraid of being deported, or they're afraid of what will happen to their family back home if they're turned in? There was no offence per se of holding someone as a slave. And it's because we threatened the authorities with Article 4 of the Convention and the Human Rights Act that we were able to force the government back in 2010 to create a new criminal offence. And I'm not normally in the business of calling for new criminal offences. There are far too many, but what a gap there was on the statute book that it took the Human Rights Act to fill. Article 5 of the Convention is the right against arbitrary detention. So that has its roots in habeas corpus and Magna Carta, of course. Article 6, the right to a fair trial, including the right to be presumed innocent in a criminal trial, and including the right to access to justice. Because all of these human rights laws will be, no matter how beautifully crafted, are as a dead letter in a sealed book if you don't have access to advice and representation. And I have to tell you that legal aid in this country is all but obliterated. It's transformed since my youth. Grew up in a country, as I think all of you did, where if you were run over in the street, you'd be scraped up off the street and put into an ambulance and taken to the emergency room, and nobody's checking your purse or wallet save for the contact details of a friend or loved one, not for your health insurance. And that's a great thing. But it's also a great thing to have grown up in a country where if something really bad was going to happen to you, whether it's criminal charges or deportation or family troubles, losing a child or whatever, you would get access to advice and representation. That's not the case anymore. It's really quite terrifying what's happened to access to justice and legal aid at the hands of politicians of all persuasions. And then there's Article 8, the right to respect for your private life, and your family life, your correspondence and your home. And I know that you were addressed by Cory Doctorow yesterday, and so you've already had a very healthy discussion, I'm sure, about all the challenges to privacy that are posed by all sorts of factors, including the technology. The technology moves apace, and the public debate, the ethical, legal, political debate seems to me to lag behind. There are so many revelations from Edward Snowden that just demonstrate the scale of the problem. And you know, whether you agree or disagree with me about whether it is legitimate to put entire civilian populations under surveillance effectively, because some of us will turn out to be a threat, I think that's hugely disproportionate and dangerous. But whether you agree or disagree with me, surely it's wrong that this was being done without public debate, without parliamentary authority, without law. That the Securocrats just built this capacity on both sides of the Atlantic and employed it without our sanction or the sanction of our democratic representatives. Surely that's wrong. Surely that's wrong. And the appetite of, yes, commercial entities, but also of the state to just scoop up everybody's internet activity, I find terrifying. Now, I want to be fair. If the Home Secretary were here, she would probably say, quite understandably, that the internet cannot be a completely ungoverned space. Bad things happen there. Bad things are planned and perpetrated online. It can't be just left like Somalia to be, to be an ungoverned space. And that's fair enough. But what I'm arguing for is proportionate, targeted surveillance, where you target people who are suspect, but you don't turn the whole population from citizens to suspects. But the Home Secretary would say, well, Shami, the innocent have nothing to fear. Have you heard this argument before? Nothing to hide, nothing to fear. It's been a common refrain since 9/11. Nothing to hide, nothing to fear. As if to crave a little privacy is to somehow be suspect, to confuse privacy with secrecy. And I think that's a really difficult argument. Because what's being proposed and what's being conducted is the equivalent of saying, well, you know, really dangerous stuff and bad stuff and violent crimes and sex crimes and other terrible things are perpetrated in people's homes. You know that's true. And, you know, I'm a woman and a feminist. I know how much domestic violence there is and how many terrible crimes happen in the family home. Most murders, for example. And that's always been the case. And so I can promise you that any domestic dwelling that's been used that way for more than a few years will be a crime scene of some kind or other. Would that justify, I ask you, now that we have the technology to do it, changing the legal and physical architecture of our country so that cameras and microphones are planted in everyone's home, everyone's living room, everyone's bedroom? And the authorities would say, but don't worry, we're not actually going to listen or watch. We're just going to collect the data, and then if subsequently there's a complaint of a crime in your home, then we'll have a look. Are you comfortable with that? Maybe some of you are, but if you're not, then I say you can't be comfortable with this internet-based surveillance on a global or a societal scale either. Some young people live more intimately in the virtual world and online than they do, you know, in their bedrooms. Think about your smartphone and what the data that is passing through and is on that smartphone. It's cool technology, but goodness me, look, we fought identity cards successfully in this country. But if any government said you must carry an electronic device that reveals who your friends are, which websites you're looking at, where you physically are, we wouldn't put up with that, would we? No, we just went and bought these things voluntarily, right? We bought these things, and I've got one. It's cool technology. You can get, shows you where the nearest pizza is, but it also tells somebody else that you're having a pizza. And maybe that feels just completely innocent and innocuous, but and when we talk about things like torture and slavery and arbitrary detention, privacy can seem a bit trivial, can't it? A bit of a bourgeois luxury like a garden hedge or net curtains. But let's think again about privacy as a societal value and its relationship with other rights and freedoms. How can you have fair elections without a secret ballot? How can you have proper medical treatment without a bit of medical confidentiality? How can you have a fair trial without confidential legal counsel? How can you have true freedom of thought, conscience and religion if you can't sometimes meet in private and take private counsel? And though sometimes privacy and free speech are in tension, no doubt about it, you know. One person's privacy is somebody else's story, you know, the newspapers and the kiss and tell dilemmas. I appreciate they are real, but equally, ask a journalist to give up their confidential sources and they will tell you what a threat that would be to journalistic freedom. So I think it's incredibly important, and you know, as we've seen from Doreen's story and from the stories of the women in the environmental movement, you know, yes, there is a role for lawful targeted surveillance, but goodness me, there can be abuse of power as well. And we certainly lack the checks and balances that we should have, I think, in this country. Then Article 9 of the Convention is freedom of thought, conscience and religion, the right to the faith of your choice, the right to no faith, and perhaps most importantly of all, I think, the right to be a heretic in any faith community. You know, to be a woman arguing for greater recognition and parity within the church, or a gay Muslim or whatever. This is, you know, this right to heresy, I think, is so important if belief systems aren't to stultify over the generations. And then Article 10, of course, freedom of expression, which is about, you know, giving and receiving, and it's so important to the work that you do. And the thing about most of these rights and freedoms is that they are what we call balanced or qualified rights. Torture and slavery are supposed to be absolutes, but privacy, conscience, even speech cannot be absolute. I'm standing up here now, and if I start inciting murder, quite rightly, I will be breaching the criminal law. There is no such thing as absolute free speech. But goodness me, we should be slow to interfere with speech, not least because if you follow through on some of these politicians' ideas about how to tackle extremism, I think you would kill the debate and the challenge to extremism that has to happen in the public square, and you just send these kids back to their bedrooms and their laptops for these ideas to ferment unchallenged. But these qualified rights are tricky because we're balancing privacy and security and free speech and security and so on. And the danger is that we compromise the rights and freedoms of particular groups in ways that we wouldn't tolerate for ourselves. Right now, my speech is free and yours is a little more expensive, but we will go to discussion quite shortly, I promise. And so there's a safeguard, and that to me is the most important human right of all. What can I be thinking? We've talked about torture and slavery and fair trials and free speech. What could be more important than any of those rights and freedoms? Well, in my opinion, you find it in Article 14 of the Convention, and that is the right to equal treatment under the law. We lawyers call it non-discrimination, but we humans perhaps call it empathy. You know, walking around in someone else's shoes, treating others as you'd like to be treated. Why do I say this is the most important human right of all? More than torture or slavery? Really? Really, Shami? I'll tell you why. Because in my opinion, if we really made this right real, there would be no torture or slavery, or disproportionate interferences with speech or conscience or privacy. Because whatever the politicians and the newspapers scream at you, everybody loves human rights, their own, and those of their family and their friends and people that they identify with. I can remember when Mr. Grayling was Lord Chancellor not so long ago, and he was going to stop prisoners having books delivered to them in prison. Do you remember this? And I went in with some writer friends who are members of Liberty, and I went into this meeting, He said, it's all right, there's the prison library where we keep well stocked with books, and they can get books in the prison library. And I said, would that be good enough for you? Would that be good enough for you, that it's only the prison governor's library, and you never get the opportunity to bend a book or mark a book or have a book that a friend gave you? So it's a completely different mindset, and it lacks empathy. And that, in a sense, is how I would ultimately sum up human rights values. 3 words: equality, dignity, fairness, but the greatest of these is equality, or equal treatment, or empathy. And what's at stake at the moment in Britain is the whole notion of universal human rights for human beings, as opposed to privileges for citizens that can be given and taken away. The government proposes to scrap our Human Rights Act, and possibly to walk out of the European Convention on Human Rights as well, to replace the Act with a British Bill of Rights and Responsibilities with Common Sense. I'm always suspicious when the title's too long. Common sense. And what's proposed is essentially that there shouldn't be human rights for foreigners, particularly if their human rights would impede their deportation, for example, to a place of torture. There shouldn't be human rights that can be invoked against the Ministry of Defence. Now that means 2 things. That means that if you're an Iraqi who was tortured at the hands of the armed forces, as has happened, no human rights protection for you. But equally, if you're one of these kids that dies mysteriously at the Deep Cut barracks, there's no human rights protection for you either. It's proposed that there should be no human rights for people who've abused their rights, for suspect people and for prisoners and all these unworthy, wretched people. They should be outside the British Bill of Rights. And then it's suggested by government policy that there should be no human rights in what they call trivial cases. Now here the mind boggles, because what is a trivial human rights violation? I guess maybe Rosa Parks should just shut up and go to the back of the bus. Yeah? I mean, what's the problem? There's seats at the back of the bus. Or people who get turned away from a particular establishment on grounds of race or sexuality. That can be, in some people's eyes, a trivial violation of rights. But of course, discrimination it turns an action from the trivial into the humiliation that it is, the rank injustice because it's discriminatory. What is a trivial human rights violation? What on earth does the government mean, and who should decide? They are tired of quote-unquote unelected judges impacting on their exercise of power, and they don't like the international nature of the human rights framework. All I would say about that is that the drafters of the Universal Declaration and the European Convention knew very well that this is a shrinking, interconnected planet. And it's even more shrinking and it's even more interconnected today than in 1945. And it seems to me that our generation and the next generation, those kids who are going to come to your libraries, as I did with my mother all those years ago, they have a choice. Should we live with citizens' privileges in one little corner of the planet and be foreigners everywhere else, with the vulnerability that comes from being treated as a foreigner? Or should we choose to be protected as human beings everywhere? I know which I would choose. It's over 6 years ago that the late, great Tom Bingham, perhaps the finest judge of my lifetime, addressed Liberty's annual conference, and he set out the various rights and freedoms far more eloquently than I've just managed to do. The right to life, against torture, against slavery, arbitrary detention, the right to a fair trial, right to privacy and conscience and free speech, equal treatment under the law. And he closed with these words: which of these rights would you like to discard? Are any of them trivial, unnecessary, superfluous, un-British? There may be some who would like to live in a country where these rights are not protected, but I am not of their number, nor am I. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Shami. So beautifully and eloquently expressed, and as somebody said earlier, the way in which you radiate the principles that you espouse is absolutely wonderful. So thank you so much for that beautiful talk. Shami has very kindly agreed to take questions from the floor. We have two colleagues with roving microphones. I believe we have one person downstairs and one upstairs. So if you wouldn't mind, just if you'd like to ask a question, putting your hand up, saying who you are and where you're from, and then Shami will be happy to answer. We might take questions in groups of 2 or 3 just to make sure we've got a few. So does anybody have a question you'd like to put to Shami? Yes, we have here. Okay. There's bright lights in the face, so fantastic.
Well, you hear me? Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. You gave me an electric shock. I come from the Netherlands, and I have a question. You were talking about human rights, and it is a very legal approach. And last years, I'm a librarian. I read some books about from Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum, and they are philosophers, and they have an approach about more the individual, more about opportunities and chances. Do you agree with them that you should also look to opportunities and chances to the individual? It is another approach than looking for rights, I think.
Thank you. Should we do a couple
more? Thank you. Is there another question? Yes, conveniently situated right next to the other chair.
I'm Judith Stewart. I'm a lecturer at University of the West of England. Is access to information a human right? Or do you think it is?
And perhaps one more?
Yeah, Richard, just there.
Steve Dale, I'm an independent consultant. I just wondered if you thought that Theresa May, or does she realise that the more the invasion of our privacy, the more likely we are to want to hide things? For example, starting to use encryption in our emails and so on? Or does she think we're all going to be quite happy to have everything that we do online collected by the agencies?
Thank you. So in order, I think the gentleman from the Netherlands is right. Rights are not the only lens through which to look at the world. That's completely true. But in fact, I told you that I spoke to the clergyman last week in Birmingham, and one of the questioners at the end said, "Is human rights the new religion, and are you the new God?" That was the most. Everyone else was very lovely. There were lots of lovely radical clerics who, care about refugees and so on. But that was the most challenging contribution. I'm like, no. The ambitions are much more modest than that. But there does have to be a framework in the world to help people rub along together, and there do need to be some red lines. But you're right. There's so much more to life than that. There's so much more to life than that, and there's so many ways that we can look at human aspirations and opportunities, and there's so much else. But I think that Amartya Sen would agree that we do need some. I know I've read some of his work, so I do think that his thinking is completely compatible with what I've talked about. The other thing I would say to you is that maybe I sound a bit too much like a lawyer, but in the end it is my job to tell people what their rights are, because I think part of our problem in Britain is that our Human Rights Act, which is what makes the European Convention enforceable here in the UK. Our Human Rights Act was passed in 1998. It was brought into force in 2000. There was no public education at all about it, partly because the new Labour government, the Blair government, had already kind of got cold feet about it to some extent. And then tragically, less than a year later, we have the 9/11 atrocity. So we've got an infant Human Rights Act that's dealing with all of these challenges, and people don't even know what they have to lose, which is why I make it my mission to go through the various hard-edged rights and freedoms and tell people what they are. And that might sound a bit legalistic, and in the end, we do need the protection of law in the end. However, I see human rights, including all of those rights and freedoms, as an ethical framework, not just a legal one. So, torture and inhuman and degrading treatment isn't just what happens in Guantanamo Bay or what happens at the hands of the terrorists in Syria or wherever. There can be inhuman and degrading treatment in the home or in the school or in the care home. And these issues don't always have to be resolved by litigation, but people do need these to engage with these values, and we all need to deliver rights and freedoms and dignity and respect for each other. So I think it's not just legal, it's kind of ethical as well. And in my campaigning work at Liberty, we use a range of tools to try and protect people's dignity. Ultimately, it all comes down to the one root word, which is dignity. The idea that every single human life is precious, not because it's a good person or a bad person or a British person or an African person, just because it's a life, and it should be treated with some dignity and respect. And that includes respecting the dignity of people who haven't always respected others and perhaps have lost their own self-respect. But it really comes from that, and I think it's as ethical and philosophical as it is legal. But ultimately, we do need the courtroom too, because we don't want to descend into barbarism. And then there was the question about information and access to information, and whether that is a human right. And yes, I do believe it's a human right, and it comes in two ways. It comes in the context of the right to education, but also free expression is now very much thought of as the giving and receiving, and the access to, not just the access to the speech, but the access to the information. So yes, absolutely, I believe that. And that's and also, if you go back to what I said about this kind of equal, how can you have equal treatment is supposed to be sort of an equal delivery of the other rights and freedoms, and in this wonderful internet age, it's incredibly important that some people don't get left behind, because some people will be so empowered, and other people could just be left behind because they don't have the access, and because they haven't had the education, or they don't have the kit, or whatever it happens to be. So I think that's incredibly important if we want to rub along together, if we want to be one society and not developing at very different paces in a very different and splintered kind of way. And then, what does Mrs. May think? I don't know, I have to go back to the Freudians for that. What does she think? I know this cat and mouse, you're so right. I mean, I think your question, you've almost asked and answered your own point, haven't you? Because, yeah, we'll have this game of cat and mouse, more and more blanket surveillance, more and more encryption, and not because we're all terrorists. Encryption because people want to protect their finances, or because people are protecting their business security, or people are protecting their legal advice. So you're quite right. You keep, yeah. It's a real shame, and it's part of what happens when you start treating everybody as a suspect. People will then have to become secretive for perfectly understandable reasons. But I think also it changes the flavour of society. That wonderful German film, The Lives of Others, from, when was it, the late 80s? The wonderful film that just demonstrates what it does to the quality of life and society when people feel watched all of the time.
Wonderful, thank you. More questions, we've got time for another round. Yes, we have one there and one from this gentleman here, and then one from John. So perhaps we could start with the lady at the back.
Hi, my name's Paula. I'm from Manchester Libraries. If there was one thing that you could ask all librarians to act upon to really support human rights and kind of getting the message out there to customers, what would you ask of us?
Well, of course, the first thing I'd say is I ask of you and the analysts and the clergy and and the butcher and the baker and the candlestick maker, I ask you all to think about joining Liberty. And then I think you have a very special role to play of course, in the way that you, because you're the keepers of the books, and there are some wonderful books for different audiences that can introduce them to their human rights. I think people have not seen the Human Rights Act. I wrote a book called On Liberty that came out in October, and my 13-year-old, who is a voracious reader and a bit too cool for school because he's 13 now, he calls my book a short book with large font, Mum. Because it's not William Dalrymple, Return of a Muggle, you know what I mean? He's like really snotty about my short book with large font, but actually the most important pages in my book are not my pages. At the end of the book, I insisted that the Human Rights Act is set out. So if anybody is given the book or anybody picks up the book and flicks through it, they will at least see a copy of the Human Rights Act that is a very short and simple and elegantly drafted piece of legislation that most people in this country, including the politicians that slag it off and the journalists that slag it off, I promise you have never opened. And that is a massive problem. So of course there are, and we were talking earlier about there are some children's books that open up. I think Amnesty produced a picture book for really quite young children some years ago. That just sort of illustrates each article of the Universal Declaration. There's my book. Tom Bingham wrote a book called The Rule of Law. I just think that we need a greater level of constitutional and human rights literacy in this country, because otherwise people just don't know what's at stake. That, in the words of that other great legal philosopher, Joni Mitchell, don't it always seem to go that you don't know what you had till it's gone.
Has to win the prize for the quote of the conference. That's fantastic. I believe we had a question at the front here. Thank you. And then, John, you wanted to come in as well. And I think.
Well, it kind of follows on from what you say. So how about putting all that, a poster, in every library? Or in every school? Why is that? Or maybe even put it alongside Magna Carta.
Well, thank you. I mean, absolutely. We do actually have a poster that's available at Liberty, which sets out all the, it's just a very simple graphic. I think it's heart-shaped or something, and it's got all the different rights and freedoms in it, just so that people know. It doesn't have to be a law lecture. It doesn't have to be very complex. People just need to know what's in there. Because when they know what's in there, they're like, why do you want to scrap this? These are my rights. Thank you for that. You can get that from Liberty if you want one.
I think we have time for
part of your membership pack.
Wonderful. I think we have time for one more. John.
Hi. Thank you very much. I'm John Dolan. I'm a member of the CILIP board, but I'm also a member of my local Amnesty group. So greetings from Amnesty friends, and of course you can all join Amnesty as well.
Hey, this is my gig,
After you've joined Liberty. We, of course, represent libraries in every sector of society, in business, in academic institutions, in schools, in prisons, as you suggested, as you mentioned, and in, of course, the universal public library. As technologies develop to enable people to protect their privacy on the web, is it conceivable, and would you help libraries, public and academic and in all those other places, to be the place where people learn these techniques for privacy, for self-protection under privacy, while funded by public money and government sanction?
Well, look, I love the way that libraries can be the most exciting modern civic space. I mean, there was a woman who spoke from Manchester earlier. I mean, that beautiful, refurb of the big, what's it called, the Central Library in Manchester is just a beautiful case in point. But it doesn't always have to be big and grand. Any library can be, as you know, you don't need me to. I don't want to teach my proverbials to suck eggs, because that a library can be so much more than a bookstore. A library can be just a living, breathing space where you have readings, where people go and meet, and they don't always have to be they can even, that you can have events, you can have opportunities for people to learn and talk. and share. One thing that I have noticed actually in my time, I've been doing this job at Liberty since 2003. I came to Liberty the day before 9/11 as a lawyer. That's why I'm the dangerous woman, you see. I go to places and bad stuff happens, but I'm sure you're all right. I'm sure you're all right today. But yeah, I started at Liberty the day before 9/11 as a lawyer, and then 2 years later I became the director. And one of the things I've noticed was that very early on, a lot of the speaking requests would come to our local Labour Party, come to our local Conservative Association, whatever it is, and lots of people would go to their political party meetings for this kind of discourse. It doesn't really happen anymore. That's really declined, people turning out to those sorts of meetings. They go instead to the cultural spaces. They go to events at museums and libraries and book festivals, the rise of the literature festival. And yes, some of it is going to hear their favourite poet or novelist, but sometimes it's me or it's Alan Johnson, or it's quite political and it's challenging, but it feels like a safe civic space for kind of kind and reasonable discourse, even over difficult subjects. So I think that you all have hopefully that wonderful opportunity to let your libraries breathe, and you don't need me to tell you, it's particularly important for people that don't have such a great space back home, that they can come to a place of books and ideas, and sometimes a safe space for discussion and debate too. So important to our communities, I think.
So thank you. I hate to bring the discussion to a close there, but we're going to have to stop at that point. Just to say thank you so much for coming to speak to us today. You will always have friends in the library and information profession, but for the time being, please join me in thanking Shami. Thank you very much.